Welcome back to Ambivalent Offenders. This is Erin, and I am joined once again by my brilliant, amazing, adorable husband who's guest hosting this week again.
Hi, everybody. I'm back. I'll try and live up to all of that, but I think, Erin, you are more adorable and smart than I am. So
you don't need to suck up to me. I'm already married to you.
Well, we probably just made a bunch of people listening throw up, so...
They just turned it off. They're like, deep, nope. Well, my sister and normal co-host Jamie will be back here soon. Shout out, Jamie. I miss talking history with you. In the meantime, Matt's helping me hold down the fort. Plus, he's a history teacher, so it helps to have him here. Before we launch back into the cutthroat world of Roman politics, I did want to remind everybody to follow us on Instagram, where you can find reels announcing the new episodes and much, much more. And if you want more episodes, more content, check out our Patreon page as well. That's all linked in the show notes. All right. That was a quick plug. Now on to the real stuff, the show. Matthew, are you ready to get back into the Roman Republic?
I am ready if I can start off with one apology. Error from last time. I foolishly said that I had never seen the film Spartacus.
Oh.
And when you brought that up, I thought for sure, there must have been a remake of Spartacus in the last 5 or 6 years. Like there's been a remake of everything else, but you were talking about the original Spartacus, weren't you?
I was. I think there was like a series on Stars or Showtime or something, but I was talking about the original.
Okay, good. Because over the last few years, everything that's old is new again. I just thought for sure that, I'm sure it's been remade. But yeah, I've obviously seen the original.
Cool. Well, thank you for the correction. Also, as a reminder, as we go into this, if I quote anything, it's going to be from the book by Patricia Southern, Mark Antony, A Life. I'll also be using some translations of our good friend Cicero.
And I'm told we're really supposed to expect some whiz-bangers from the old Cicero.
What's a whiz-banger?
That's a colloquialism that the elderly employ. And that's kind of where I am right now in my life. So.
Okay, well, there will be whiz-bangers then of Cicero. There's some nasty stuff, really nasty stuff. As a recap, we ended our first episode with Julius Caesar triumphant in the Civil War, after his rival, Pompey the Great, was unceremoniously killed on a beach in Egypt. Not by Caesar, but thanks to the Pharaoh of Egypt, who was trying to ingratiate himself with Julius Caesar. Pursuing his enemy, Caesar would arrive in Egypt shortly after Pompey was killed, and he was presented with the head of the great Pompey.
Gross.
Yes, not a great gift, and he didn't enjoy that. He was not happy with this gift from the Egyptians, even though it did ultimately help him consolidate power and end the civil war in his favor. It's a bad look to have some foreigners kill a Roman citizen. That wouldn't do.
Especially a Roman citizen of that stature.
Exactly. Pompey he had been the greatest general that Rome likely had seen in decades, if not ever. So this is not great. While in Egypt, Caesar becomes involved himself in Egyptian politics. And this is where he becomes acquainted with Cleopatra, the infamous last queen of Egypt. So at that time, Cleopatra was involved in her own civil war against her brother husband, Ptolemy, the one who had Pompey killed. And yes, you heard that right. Her brother husband. Unfortunately, Egyptian incest was commonplace during the Ptolemaic dynasty. Although, to be fair to Cleopatra, she doesn't seem to have liked her brother. And so it's a marriage in name only, at least for them.
Okay, so it's a relationship of convenience.
Yes, she'll actually marry another brother too, and they're much younger than her. So as the older sibling, she's kind of got the upper hand. While the brother-sister, the couple's co-rulership had ultimately broken down, resulting in this civil war. It's outside the scope of our episode, so I'm not going to get into all that detail, but just know that Caesar, in helping arbitrate this Egyptian civil war, ended up becoming, I like to call it, allies with benefits with Cleopatra.
Oh, okay. I've never heard that turn of phrase before, but I think I understand what you mean.
Wink, wink. By the time he left Egypt later in 47 BC, he left Cleopatra pregnant or having just given birth to their son. Her son was Caesar, called Caesarion. Caesar, he never says that the son isn't his, at least in the eyes of the Egyptians. Caesar now has a legal son and heir. The Romans would not have seen it that way. They had very strict rules about that in terms of marrying foreigners or having children with foreigners. Now for Caesar, even with Pompey dead, he does still have to figure out what to do with Pompey's followers. After all, there were plenty of highborn men who had sided with Pompey to deal with. Every elite man had been made to choose sides, and many of them thought Pompey was a better bet with his previous victories. We already talked about he was a very great general. He was the proven general compared to Caesar, who, yes, he had victories, but it made sense that a lot of people had flocked to Pompey's banner. Plus, Pompey appealed to that optimates faction.
The more conservative group.
Yep. In the first episode, we spoke about the optimates versus populares faction. So Pompey had represented the Senate, the old order of things, the sanctity of the republic, while Caesar represented the populares, but also, he had his own unique flavor, his own authoritarian tendencies, which scared the senators who thought, correctly as it turned out, that he might put the republic in danger. So Pompey had a list of important senators who had sided with him, like two men whose names might sound familiar if you know anything about Julius Caesar, Brutus, and Cassius.
Those do ring a bell.
Yep.
Or a blade.
Oh, no.
Oh, sorry, foreshadowing. I don't want to spoil anything.
I don't think you're spoiling it, babe. If anybody knows anything about Julius Caesar, they probably know the end. Of course, our good friend Cicero was also in the mix. Caesar could be ruthless when he needed to be, but he was also known for his clemency. He granted clemency to his enemies, so he forgave Brutus, Cassius, and Cicero, among others who had flocked to Pompey's banner. Of course, forgiveness is good in theory, but in practice, well, Caesar's going to learn the hard way that sometimes eliminating the people who were against you is the only way you survive.
So he creates the opportunity through his own sense of charity for enemies to rise up later and topple him.
Exactly. And this isn't the first instance that we know that Caesar granted forgiveness or clemency. We go back to the first part when we talked about Cicero and Catiline. Caesar had advocated forgiving Catiline, so he's always had that bent. Now, let's check back in on our main subject, Mark Antony. While Caesar indulged in all the luxury that Egypt had to offer, Antony was not enjoying himself in Rome. Remember when we talked about that Antony was kind of holding down the fort? He had done good the first go-around, maybe a few too many appearances with the mistress, but hey, hasn't that gotten all of us a little bit in trouble?
What? That's a strange way to put it.
Well, now things aren't going so hot. To be fair to Antony, the air in Rome was rife with tension after the end of the Civil War. A quote from the book says, "Opportunists and men with grievances stirred troubles for their own benefit."
So can I just jump in and ask, at this point, he has his reputation for being kind of a playboy and unorthodox and bohemian and wearing scandalous tunics.
Short tunics.
Is that why he starts to stumble in Rome? Because he's too inclined every couple of weeks to be spotted in public misbehaving with or without one of his mistresses? Or is it just the case that the city is growing restless because they don't really know what the outcome of this interregnum is going to be? I'm sorry, I've kind of lost I'm not even sure how old he is at this point. Is he in his mid-30s?
He's in his 30s. Yeah, it's a good question. So Cicero would want us to believe that, yes, Antony's lost favor because he's partying it up, hanging out with his mistress.
But we can't trust Cicero, right?
No, but I'll talk here soon about some other things that he really does do that don't help his cause. And for that last point, I think it's a combo of things. He's not maybe the most upstanding man in his personal life. And then you have just Rome being nervous because the Civil War has ended. They don't know what's going to happen next. We've seen civil wars break out before in Rome, and it usually ends with bloodshed. So I think there's probably a thought that maybe there could be another purge coming along, things along that line. But then, yes, Antony's also going to misplay some things. First of all, in 46 BC, this is when he makes Caesar dictator for the year. This is going to be one thing that is going to make the Senate not so happy. The title dictator sounds scary to us, but it is an actual role for the Romans. They had thought ahead far enough to know that sometimes in times of great trouble, they might need one guy to steer the ship. But they always had a time limit on that power. You could only be a dictator for 6 months. So Antony was now granting Caesar the dictatorship for a year, unprecedented. And there would be no consuls that year either, just a dictator.
It's so strange to think of the idea of a dictatorship that has an expiration date attached to it.
Yeah, that's just how we see it nowadays.
Throughout most of history, the corners of history with which I'm more familiar, whenever you try and do that timeline, that stopwatch for it, it just doesn't seem to quite work out that way.
No. Well, and in the past, it had worked well. Like the early republic, isn't that Cincinnatus was a dictator and then he lays it down?
Right.
So it had happened before, but now they're using it for their own gains. And Antony gets his own role, too. He becomes the dictator's deputy or master of the horse. So he's getting some good stuff, too. Antony's officially his number 2. But Antony really overplays his hand here because he goes into the Senate with bodyguards, a lot of bodyguards, and he wears not the traditional toga that they would wear in the Senate, but he comes in wearing the purple cloak of a general. He has a sword and armor on, so not very subtle, although Antony, I don't think, would even say himself that he's a man of subtlety. They're ruling with might, not right, if you can kind of think of it that way.
And not really trying to hide that fact.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
The book by Patricia Southern is this is a quote that I think is really good that sums it up. Quote, if he had resorted to a toga and stately appearance, moderated his speech and attitudes, and kept his very real power veiled, he may have fared better after Caesar's return to Rome. So Antony's not making friends. We'll just say that. We'll see later on that Octavian, the future Augustus, in contrast, he does know the art of subtlety, of pretense and pretend, that you can be as powerful as a king if you want, so long as you play the part. You're just one of the guys, one of the senators. This is an art that, sadly, Antony never learned. It didn't help that Antony never did pay for those houses he got from Pompey that we talked about in that first part. Remember, This is the personal life things that are making him unpopular. He basically throws giant keg parties at these beautiful Pompeian houses.
Well, what's not to like about that?
It's very frat boy, to be honest. If you believe Cicero, though, Antony went through all of Pompey's fine wine in a matter of days. Just days. He's living it up, we shall say.
So he's not just living in luxury. The luxury's been essentially donated to him. Mm-hmm. And he's given Rome no indication that he's willing to do the virtuous, responsible thing and pay his bills.
Exactly. And again, in contrast with Octavian and even Caesar, Antony seemed unwilling to play the part of a politician. He was who he was, take it or leave it. He's just being Mark Antony, the party boy. Things got worse in the relationship between Antony and the Senate, with the death blow being Antony's rivalry with Dolabella, who's a man who happened to be Cicero's son-in-law. Cicero's Antony's enemy. You don't really need to know much about Dolabella, just that he created more trouble in Rome while Antony's ruling Rome by essentially starting a riot in the Forum in Rome, all around the cancellation of debt. So he's basically starts this riot by putting the specter of, oh, maybe we should cancel all the debt. And we know if there's anything that's going to get people out in numbers, it's the prospect of eliminating their debt. Remember, that's what Catiline used to get people on his side. So there's a big riot. It's a mob, basically, in the Forum. The Senate begged Antony to restore order. Okay, now they want his help, which Antony did, but in the process, he created something of a bloodbath. There's about 800 people who were killed in this attempt to put down this mob in the Forum. So it's an absolute slaughter.
My God.
We've seen things in other parts of history when there's a lot of people and then the government comes in and makes a mess of it. It's the same thing here. It's horrible. And the Senate, the ones who had begged Antony to help, they turned their back on him disapprovingly after this. They're the ones who wanted him to do it, but he didn't do it in the way that was good, that he killed a lot of people.
Yeah, it was perceived as too brutal, I take it.
Mm-hmm. There were rumors, too, that Antony had been spurred into violence because his wife Antonia had been having an affair with Dolabella. So it's around this time that Antony divorces his first wife, his cousin Antonia. We don't know whether it was because of this affair, if the affair was real or something else. Who knows? Roman divorce is very, very, very common. It could be for any number of reasons. But for the Romans, it looked like a causation. They felt that Antony had acted out of sheer emotion and had caused hundreds of deaths because of it. Not great for his reputation. The wheels were really coming off of Antony's leadership of Rome. So when Julius Caesar does finally return to Rome.
Yeah, I have to wonder, is he, when Caesar finally gets back, he has to be somewhat disappointed.
Yes.
Am I understating that? Is he outraged?
He's not mad. He's disappointed, definitely. He thinks distancing himself from Antony might be for the best at this point. We know Caesar has been Antony's supporter through and through, but now Antony's, officially on the outs. He gets no political positions, nothing in the year 46 BC, which is a big change for him. Caesar is basically cutting him off. And in order to sort of retroactively undo some of Antony's worst moves, Julius Caesar does force him to pay up for Pompey's house, which is good. He should. Antony should have paid up anyway. But worse, when Caesar goes on campaign again, Antony is nowhere to be found among his men, a clear sign that all was not well between the two men. So Caesar will go on several campaigns after this, and Antony's not there. And when he's in Rome, he does not have any power. He does not have any political power, no political office.
Wow. So at this point, if you were just trying to game out what you anticipate to be the rest of his career arc, you would probably say, oh, he's headed for the footnotes. He's not likely to. So we have a come from behind, like a underdog story here about to emerge? Okay.
We do. I mean, to be fair to Mark Antony, he does seem like he's on the brink of just irrelevancy several times in his life. Well, this isn't even the first time we'll talk about it in this very episode. So he does have a comeback story continually. It's here, too, that a few women enter our story, women who would play a key role in the rest of Mark Antony's life. We know Caesar had Cleopatra in Rome with him, staying at his villa, which, of course, the rest of the Romans hated. The idea of this foreign woman, this foreign queen, staying with Caesar. Cleopatra would actually be in Rome at Caesar's villa when he was assassinated. We think this is when Mark Antony must have met her. If he had not met her before when he was in Alexandria on campaign, well, Cleopatra might have had her eyes only on Caesar. Antony remarried around this time, choosing a very important woman in Rome, Fulvia, who we've also mentioned in the first part. The Romans, they hate any woman who tries to meddle in politics, so Fulvia's reputation is absolutely horrible. It's awful. The records are not flattering. To us modern people, though, she seems like an absolute badass. I mentioned in part 1 that Fulvia had been married to 2 of Antony's bad boy friends, Clodius and Curio.
Oh, right. So she has a type, right?
She does have a type, yeah. They were both tribunes of the plebs, too. With the death of her first husband, it's presented that she became kind of like a female warlord commanding his followers or gangs. So very badass. Whether or not she was that involved, we don't really know, because it would suit people like Cicero, who hated her first 2 husbands. And again, we know he'll hate her third husband, Antony. So it suits him to present her in the worst possible light as possible. For the Romans, a woman doing anything besides sitting home, weaving, having babies was bad news. I would love it to be true, though, that she was a female warlord commanding these gangs, doing all this shit. We'll see that she does even more later.
Okay. So she's going to be as rebellious as he was in her own way, then?
Yeah, she is. And Fulvia and Antony's marriage is presented to us as a love match, 2 people equally matched. Here's another quote from the book. It was said it was Fulvia who tamed him and accustomed him to obey the orders of a woman, end quote.
My.
Wow, we ain't got to call BS on that one. This is all like a trope that, once Antony hooks up with Cleopatra, they all say that, oh, she's got him wrapped around his little fingers. And for the Romans, a man being in the thrall of a woman is about the worst possible thing they can imagine. Well, actually, second worst. The worst is to be in the thrall of a foreign woman.
Of a foreign woman, sure.
They are very xenophobic. There are, though, some really cute anecdotes about Fulvia and Antony. There's one that he's away from home. He ends up going home early, disguised as a messenger with a letter from Antony. He gives Fulvia this romantic letter and he watches her cry, and then Antony takes off the disguise and they hug and presumably bone. That's not in the text. That's just my conjecture.
The primary source doesn't get into that degree of detail.
No.
Okay.
But I'm going to say
darn.
what's happened.
Okay.
They do also go on to have 2 sons together. They won't come up in this episode, but they'll come up later in our next episode. Antulus and Iulus. Caesar, meanwhile, even without Antony, he's continuing from success to success. He's having triumphs for his battles. He's also passing a lot of reforms, including the reorganization of the calendar. I know you're obsessed with the calendar.
Oh, I did dig into that a little bit. I think obsessed might go a little bit far, but no, they don't redo it, but they make some slight tweaks to it.
Yep. So. Yeah. Antony, though, is not doing much at all. He's still very left on the outside. Even Octavian, Caesar's young great-nephew, who's in his late teens, was getting in on the action in Caesar's military campaign in Spain. Though Octavian is always ill. Even later on in some of his greatest battles, he's either seasick or sick. But he is starting to appear alongside Julius Caesar at this point. It's likely around this time, too, that Caesar ends up putting Octavian in his will to be adopted posthumously. The book has this amazing passage about the difference between the young teenager Octavian and in the late 30s Mark Antony. They really are complete opposites in the way they moved through life. It's a little bit of a longer passage, but I just feel like it really sums up these 2 different men, these men who are going to be in contrast with each other for the rest of their life, or, well, rest of Mark Antony's life, I will say. Quote, Octavian was a discreet youth, shrewd and level-headed, who knew when to talk and when to remain silent. There could be no greater antithesis to Antony, full of life, indiscreet, probably noisy when he should have been quiet, silent when he should have been saying something, end quote. We're starting to get that contrast with Octavian and Mark Antony. So Octavian's on the rise. He's hanging out with his great uncle Caesar, and Mark Antony. He's not doing much. He's still on the outs. But Mark Antony does gain favor again with Caesar before Caesar's assassination. At one point, he just goes off to meet with Caesar, and soon it's like they had never parted. They were just on a break. It wasn't a true breakup.
I'm going to ask a question here that's probably really dumb, and maybe one of those questions that a scholar would say, oh, just put that back on the shelf because we're never going to know. But to my mind, Caesar is more sober, disciplined, certainly ambitious, certainly willing to abandon caution, but he just seems to be leading a more organized, sort of rigid life. I think this is a man who wakes up every day and he has goals. There are items in that box on the calendar.
Yes. Kill the Gauls.
Right. And
check.
Oh, yeah, what's the old Eddie Izzard bit? The Roman day planner is conquer, lunch, conquer.
Basically.
But Mark Antony seems more impulsive, charismatic, fun. And I wonder,
he's so much more fun.
Is it possible that the two of them are, here comes the question, the really bad question. Do they sort of, this is like one of those, you're on the couch on an afternoon TV talk show and it's a bad question, but do they look into one another's lives and in some way see the thing that they lack in themselves? And is that why they're paired together here so frequently?
Yeah, again, I don't think we'd ever really know. It's more like the psychology of them, but I think that's a good guess. They do balance each other out, if you want to say that. I think they have a lot of the same tendencies, but Mark Antony is more fun. Not that Caesar doesn't get up to things. Caesar definitely liked to screw anything that moved. We'll say that. So he was not indiscreet in terms of his own, sexual relationships, but at least in his public persona, much more restrained than Mark Antony for sure. Mark Antony at this point, he's back as Caesar's number 2 guy. Caesar even promised Mark Antony the role of consul alongside himself, of course, for 44 BC. So finally, he's back on top. Things never looked more promising for Mark Antony. But all those promises were not to be. The Ides of March stopped those visions in their tracks. Problems about Caesar's dictatorship and that age-old problem of one-man rule had begun to surface. The warning signs were there. Supposedly, at one point, Caesar said that Sulla, one of those previous strong men who had ruled Rome, who we mentioned in passing in the first episode, Caesar said Sulla was dumb for ever having given up being dictator. So, alarm bells for the Senate. It's like, fire. Just pondering that is not great. Caesar's enemies in the Senate, men like Brutus, Cassius, names again you might have heard before, they were all chafing under his rule. They had never been fans of Caesar, and how he was acting was not changing things. These guys, they're the optimates. They're that faction we spoke about in the first part. Like you said, conservative, lowercase c, men who hated that Caesar was throwing off tradition left and right. I love that the book does point out that these senators were not just in it for the idea of the liberty of the Senate, this high-handed idea. What they really wanted was to keep the freedom to continue what they had always been good at, exploiting the ordinary people. The breaking point is often seen as February 14th, 44 BC.
Valentine's Day.
Yes, it's very romantic because this is when Caesar was declared dictator for life.
That's quite a Valentine.
I know. I'm trying to think of a clever thing to say, that there's never going to be a breakup with Caesar, at least according to him. The people of Rome were going to be married to him for the rest of their life.
Will you be mine forever? And that's right. That's where it ends. Isn't that the end of the story?
Yeah. And everything turned out well after that. But just recall, remember we just talked about this, that dictator is supposed to be just a 6-month term.
Yeah, I still find that hilarious. But
yes, he had been one for a year, and now it's for life. Dictator was never intended to be something you had for life. This last action seemed to be like a red line that Caesar had finally crossed for his enemies. That same month occurred the famous story of Mark Antony offering Julius Caesar a crown. So the story goes that at the festival of the Lupercalia, which is a very old Roman festival, Antony, dressed only in a loincloth, which is part of because the Lupercalia is all about fertility. So I know the loincloth's not important, but it's worth noting. Just had to say it.
Is that what he's supposed to wear?
Yeah, as part of the Lupercalia. Yeah, it's
wow.
It's not just him. It's a bunch of dudes in loincloths. Well, Antony, in his loincloth, approached Caesar on his golden chair, holding a laurel wreath wrapped around a crown. Crowns only mean one thing.
Monarchy. Rome's biggest fear.
Yes, the crowd goes silent as Antony's offering it. To be dictator, that's one thing, but a king, the Romans were not on board with that. Their whole origin story is throwing off kings. They're not about to invite one in. So Caesar refuses the crown. He refused it. The crowd goes wild. He's offered it again by Mark Antony. Same thing. We don't know if these actions by Antony were prearranged, either to test the waters, see the reactions of the Romans.
Sure looks that way.
Or it could be to show the Romans that Caesar was not trying to be king, if you want to read it that way. But whatever it was meant to do, it backfired spectacularly. Sure, Caesar had refused it, but everybody's asking what happens next time. Of course, if Caesar anticipated that there would be a next time, he was mistaken. It would only be a month later, after the crown was offered, on March 15th, the Ides of March, that a group of senators who called themselves the Liberators stabbed Caesar to death during a meeting of the Senate. So, yikes. Which I just realized, well, one, the Ides of March are approaching quite literally because we're recording this in March.
They're getting close.
But also, our anniversary is only a day off of the Ides of March. I don't know what that says about us.
Well, we did get married and then the whole world kind of fell apart in 2020.
Yes,
so
we got married March 14th, 2020, and then literally the next day you could not get married because
in our corner of the world. Yeah, other parts of the world had already woken up to what was about to change, but in our part of the world, it was March 14th was the last sort of normal day.
Mm-hmm. Well, about Caesar's murder, no, Caesar did not say "Et tu, Brutus." His supposed final words were perhaps even more sad. I find them so sad. Spoken in Greek to Brutus, he said, "You too, my child." Well, I don't know. That gets me. I know he's a dictator and he's an authoritarian, but "You too, my child."
Didn't you tell me that the historical record speculates that as consciousness leaves his body, he's staring up at a statue of Pompey?
Yeah, since the Senate House had been burned down, which we talked about in the first part, the Senate had met in Pompey's theater, of all places. So we are told that Caesar did indeed die at the foot of a statue of Pompey the Great himself. The Romans, they loved a sign, they loved an omen. This would have been chef's kiss. This is perfect. There had been talk about killing Mark Antony as well as part of the plot. Antony was, after all, Caesar's man through and through. So it makes sense that if you're going to eliminate Caesar, you eliminate Antony. But Brutus had apparently stopped this. Instead, the Liberators had men distract Mark Antony outside of Pompey's theater, called him over to do some sort of conversation just to keep him out of the theater so that the murder could go ahead. Antony would have been outside when there's just all this chaos. People are running as the senators fled the theater, both those who had been involved in the actual killing and those who had just been witness there were only about 40 to 60 men who were involved in the conspiracy. So a very small number compared to the Senate. The Senate at that time had about 900 men. So 40 to 60, not that much. Of course, other men like Cicero would have known about the plot or suspected it, but hadn't done anything to stop it. To quote Cicero himself in a speech later on, Cicero says, "In truth, all good men, as far as it depended on them, bore a part in the slaying of Caesar. Some did not know how to contrive it, some had not courage for it, some had no opportunity. Everyone had the inclination." Yeah.
Is that fair on his part?
Is it fair to say everybody?
Right. He's blanketly saying that nobody there thinks, oh, maybe strongman rule would be preferable to having 900 of us scheme against one another every day.
Don't ask for fairness when it comes to Cicero. You ain't gonna get it. He's a man who liked his dramatics. If there was like a Real Housewives of the Senate, Cicero would have been perfect for it. So still outside the theater with Caesar's body lying inside, Antony fled the scene, disguised as a slave. He would have had slaves on him, following with him, as every great man did. So they must have done a little costume swap. He first goes to a friend's house to hide out while the chaos died down, and then he eventually makes his way back to his own home, locking the door and ready for a siege. He must have known that his life was now in grave danger with how closely associated he was with Caesar. No other man had been as closely linked to him. But luckily for Antony, no one came to kill him. The liberators had gotten what they wanted. Caesar was dead. But unfortunately for the liberators, things were not going as smoothly as they had hoped. So the ordinary people had liked Caesar because he had been a populares, a populist, and he passed reforms for them. And he had a lot of soldiers who remained loyal to him through everything. He was their livelihood. So when the liberators tried to give this speech to the crowd after the murder about what heroes they were and that they had saved the Republic, they were not hailed as the heroes they thought they would be, and they were promptly made to flee the crowd for fear of their own lives.
Okay, so this really backfires.
Oh, yeah, it was not going to plan. If they had a plan at all, which it seemed increasingly like they had not, it seems like they just thought with Caesar dead, they'd be celebrated and things would go back to how things were before. I have to repeat, there was no plan. You will see there was no plan. They do not do anything next. Antony's actions post Caesar's assassination really do give us a glimpse at Antony the statesman. We don't often focus on that part of him. Obviously, we focus on the more military side of him. Things were tense in Rome. So the liberators, as they called themselves, they were still in the city. So they stayed in the city, and they were on Capitol Hill, almost paralyzed with indecision on their next steps after the Romans' anger at the death of Caesar. They were really not doing anything. They're just kind of waiting things out. Meanwhile, Antony was doing a lot. In the 2 days after the murder of Caesar, he had to very swiftly figure out who was with him and who was against him, who had been involved in the murder and who had not. Lepidus, another one of Caesar's men and from a very, very patrician family, reached out to Antony at this very opportune time. Good. Antony needed all the allies he could get. Like all alliances, a marriage followed. Well, the promise of a marriage followed. So Antony betrothed his daughter to Lepidus' son so that they could be bound together. Antony had also gotten hold of Caesar's papers from Caesar's widow. More controversially, though, he had taken money from one of the treasuries, not the main treasury, which was in the Temple of Saturn, but one of the smaller ones. Later in the Philippics, which are speeches against Antony by Cicero, Cicero accused Antony of using that money to help pay down his debts. So he's saying that Antony just took the money in the treasury to help himself pay down his debts, get himself debt-free.
Convenient. this is a theme in his life, isn't it? Money is not handling money
No.
is not his strong suit.
No. It seems like he really could have benefited from a financial planner, of all things. Cicero even says, though, that it was Antony, not any of the liberators, who truly benefited from Caesar's death. So here's a quote from Cicero. So he says, Antony, you, quote, delivered yourself from an enormous burden of debt at the temple, who by your dealings with the account books there squandered a countless sum of money, who have had such vast treasures brought to you from Caesar's house. In truth, what measure except the death of Caesar could possibly have had any relief to your indigent and insolvent condition, end quote. It's all about saying that you really did benefit. You took things from Caesar. You took stuff from the temple. You took from the treasury at the temple. So I guess at this point we can say, is this true? Well, we know Cicero hates Mark Antony. Is this just Cicero saying things? It does seem like he did pay his debts soon after Mark Antony did. So for once, I think we could say that Cicero might be on to something. For once,
so
we'll give
the
it to him.
evidence might be more than circumstantial. But
yeah, but to be fair to Antony, money was needed at this time, not just for his own expenses, but Caesar had troops and people that needed to be paid. It's not just for his own debts. With Caesar gone, Antony was, like it or not, the man in charge, and he acted really quickly and efficiently. 2 days after the murder, Mark Antony, as consul that year, remember he is consul, called the Senate to come together. You know this is going to be an amazing meeting. Not awkward at all. The liberators were there, and everyone got to speak. Mark Antony, for all his loyalty to Caesar, he didn't just allow pro-Caesar speeches. The liberators are there. The people who were against Caesar are there. So good for him there. He's not cracking down on speech or action. He could have just rounded up the liberators if he wanted to. But what Mark Antony really wanted was to steer Rome out of this crisis without any further bloodshed. But there's a problem. What to do with the liberators, you know? They're very rich and powerful men themselves, senators. Mark Antony couldn't just say Caesar had been a tyrant, a would-be king, and toss aside all that Caesar had done, because it wasn't just about Julius Caesar. If Mark Antony just said he's a tyrant, he was bad, the entire government, which was filled with all men and governors that Caesar had appointed, then they'd have to all be replaced, like all at once, which is impossible. Imagine just replacing an entire government. If you wanted to do that, it would just be chaos, and it was already chaotic. But on the other hand, could Mark Antony really let Brutus and Cassius and the other liberators get away with murder? Everybody knew what happened. There was no ambiguity. Their guilt was obvious.
Well, and doesn't he have the lesson of Caesar's generosity already having been paid back in blood?
Yep.
This is probably going to be a question that doesn't deliver back anything we would find satisfying, but do we have any evidence of how he wrestled with these questions? You know, do I want to be seen as magnanimous and charitable and forgiving, or do I want to be retaliatory? We don't know any of that, do we?
No, but I think you can.
I mean, we know what he did, but we don't know how he deliberated through them.
No, but I think you could extrapolate from his actions, because he walks the thinnest of tightropes. And he does actually find a path to reconciliation between the two sides. What he does, the compromise, is he's going to confirm all of Caesar's acts before the 15th of March, the day Caesar was killed. In return, there would be no hunting down of the liberators, no purges, no civil war. So they'd be let off for the assassination of Julius Caesar. To show even that he meant what he said, that he was going to not go after them, that there'd be no retribution. Mark Antony, he sent his infant son to the liberators as a hostage.
Okay, that's commitment.
I really hope that Mark Antony discussed this with Fulvia before promising this. Otherwise, if it was me, he'd be a dead man. that just shows you saying, I'm not just saying that. I'm not just lulling you into a state where you feel like you're going to be fine and then coming for you. No, he's sending his infant son. There's so many people say that because of infant mortality, that parents weren't close to their kids in the past. Well, that's bullshit. Parents loved their kids just as much then as they do now. So I think you could say, yeah, that's commitment, babe. That's commitment.
Definitely. Awkward for the child, though. Of course, I suppose they're too young to know that they're being used as a pawn, but still.
And Antony also hosts a series of dinners with him, Lepidus, his friend, and the liberators. It's a show to the people of Rome that all was well, or as well as it could be. I just can't imagine how awkward those dinners would be, but that didn't matter. What mattered was there was no civil war. There is a story that during one of these dinners, Mark Antony asked Cassius if he had a knife with him. His answer was, yes, a large one, in case you become a dictator.
Very, very out in the open.
Mm-hmm. But you have to give it up to Mark Antony at this time. He's not known for his statecraft, but he plays this pitch perfect. I wouldn't say that Rome's not tense, but things are settling down. It's now simmering. It's not a hot boil, if you will. You want to use a kitchen metaphor. Caesar's will was read by Antony as well. Antony received some things in accordance with the will, as did many of the men who had killed Caesar. This is the poignant part of Julius Caesar's story. He had forgiven and trusted the very same men who ultimately murdered him, even after they had chosen Pompey in the Civil War. And some of Caesar's money also would go to each Roman citizen, so each Roman citizen got some money from Caesar. But the biggest surprise and the biggest benefactor was Caesar's great-nephew, the 18-year-old Octavian.
Someone we definitely need to focus on, right?
Yes. And just a note on naming. Technically at this time, Octavian was called Octavius, but then he changes it to Octavian. Who cares? We're going with Octavian because he's already going to become Augustus later on. It's already confusing enough with the naming, so I'm just going with Octavian. So Caesar adopted Octavian in his will, which was strange even then. Adoption was really commonplace in Rome, but not posthumously. It's debatable if it was even legal, but Octavian took it very seriously. Still, Antony acted as if he was Caesar's heir by organizing Caesar's funeral. Octavian didn't live in Rome, so he was making his way to Rome. Mark Antony just goes ahead, does Caesar's funeral. We know that Caesar's bloody and torn toga was displayed at the funeral, just to show this is what they did. And Caesar was officially declared a god. With Octavian, again, still on his way to Rome, Mark Antony did give a funeral speech, although we don't have the text of it.
Oh, no.
I know. We can assume in spirit, if not exact words, it's like the speech that William Shakespeare has Mark Antony given his play. In words, it's sort of nice to the liberators, but in spirit, it's simmering with this cold, controlled anger. Whatever he said, we know that the people of Rome were ready to make the liberators pay after it. So it must have not been something so boring, so good to the liberators, because the people of Rome are out for blood after this. They wanted to burn the houses of the liberators down to the ground. So they go off from the funeral and burn some shit down.
Here's a dumb question.
Yeah.
If I can jump in. Well, throughout history, the name that you pick, the name that you manage to win public attachment for to your cause has huge benefits, whether Federalists and Anti-Federalists or Bolsheviks and Mensheviks. I'm just curious where the liberators, that's their self-proclaimed title.
Yes, that is what they call themselves.
But surely these people who want their heads don't call them.
No.
Is there another name that got thrown around, or have we lost that?
I don't think so. They would just seen them as murderers, quite honestly. We always call them the liberators, but that is, yes, their name, because they thought that they were freeing the Republic from this dictator from this authoritarian. But that is important that that's what they've known themselves as. Everybody else didn't quite see it that way. Anyway, now after this funeral, things are burning. The attempted peace was over. Riots had broken out all over Rome. Antony's doing his best to douse them out before they destroyed the entire city. Not all that Antony did had legal precedent. So, for example, he murdered a man who had put up an altar of Caesar, calling for the blood of the liberators. So Antony kills this man. He doesn't have a trial. He just has him killed.
Okay.
So outside of the law, Antony does allow, though, the liberators to leave Rome. So they're thinking this is going to help in terms of the bloodletting. But with them leaving, there still remained the unresolved nature of Caesar's death. No one had been made to pay for it. You can think of this deep wound in Rome being stitched up with a Band-Aid. That's not going to hold out forever. Antony's just really working at this time to preserve Caesar's legacy and what he was working on when he got killed. And the Senate hated it. They hated every moment of it. The Senate we've talked about, which is led by, think of it, like Cicero's not really a head of the Senate, but he's the man in charge. He hates Mark Antony, so the rest of the Senate hates him. It's in this stressful period where Octavian finally arrives in Rome and into our story. We had already talked about him having spent some time with his great-uncle Caesar while Antony was on the outs. Octavian was really young. He's only 18 years old at this time and virtually unknown in Rome itself. He was raised out in Italy, but outside of Rome. Compare that to Mark Antony, who's been at Caesar's side for a while now and is very much a known entity. In a short time, Octavian would show his true colors, the ruthlessness hidden behind these delicate looks of a young teenager. Octavian, unlike Antony, was not going to let the liberators get away with what they did to his now adopted father, Caesar. For him, each of the liberators to a man had to be punished. They would have to die for what they did, an eye for an eye. This is really going to set him at odds with Mark Antony, who we had seen brokered that peace between the liberators and the supporters of Caesar. Octavian would work to align himself with his adopted father, Julius Caesar. He held games for Caesar, where there's a story that this comet went across the sky, which Octavian says, yes, of course, that shows that Caesar is now a god. In terms of propaganda, having a god as a father was good PR for Octavian.
I can imagine that would be the case.
He's not just doing it for the sake of dear old dad. Antony's not a stupid man. He must have known that Octavian was going to come for him at some point as the other man associated with Caesar. In Octavian's eye, there could only be one spiritual heir to Julius Caesar, and that was him. The only way, really, to stop Octavian's power grab at this point probably would have been to kill him. But no matter what the Senate thought about Mark Antony, he wasn't going to commit cold-blooded murder. We'll see repeatedly that if Caesar's fatal flaw was his clemency, Antony's was he held out hope for reconciliation and was slow to move against Octavian time and time again, even when he should have been preparing himself for a battle. We will see it here. We'll see it later on. Despite what happened in the post-Julius Caesar assassination where he acts quickly, he never acts quickly against Octavian.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
Octavian, meanwhile, was cozying up to Mark Antony's haters, your enemies. Enemy is your friend kind of thing.
Yes. You see that strategy a lot throughout this story, I think. But the friendships and the enemies change every half hour, it seems.
Cicero, as a very influential senator, saw in Octavian a means to an end to get rid of Mark Antony, or at least have a counterweight. Cicero's been bummed that Mark Antony wasn't killed along with Caesar. It was like, why didn't we just kill him? There's this fear among the senators, rightly or wrongly, that Mark Antony could be Caesar 2.0, which I'm not quite sure bears out with all the facts. Like, the fear that they have for Mark Antony, I don't know. I don't see why they're so scared of him at this point, because he abolishes the dictatorship. It doesn't seem like he's moving to be Julius Caesar. I think it's just more anger at him continuing to push through Caesar's legacy projects, things like land reform. So these are things that the more conservative faction of the Senate, the Optimates, hated.
Right. Going all the way back to well before Caesar was in Gaul. That was before he rose to fame. That tension was underneath the surface as soon as Rome began to expand.
It's just weird. I just don't understand why they're at this point really scared of Mark Antony, because he doesn't seem like he's moving to do anything. He's not declaring himself a dictator or anything at this time. Kind of a question mark for me why at this point they're just really against him. From the beginning, when sweet baby Octavian entered the scene, everybody discounted him and the threat he posed. Little did they know what kind of psychopath lay beneath the exterior of this young man who's going to eventually become the first emperor. This is really the true irony here in thinking that Mark Antony was the true danger to the Republic. And to him personally, Cicero befriended and fosters Octavian's ambitions, essentially letting the fox into the henhouse, a very ruthless fox out for blood. The Senate's going to praise Octavian, this young man, as their hero who's going to save them all from Mark Antony. But it'd be Octavian, not Mark Antony, who would deal the final blow to the Roman Republic.
So Cicero cultivates this relationship with Octavian purely out of his disregard for Mark Antony, or
it seems like it
something else? So it's just a personal vendetta?
It seems like it, because remember, Cicero hated Julius Caesar, so it's not like he's a Caesarian and wanted to support Octavian because he's Caesar's heir. You know, it seems like the only reason is because he thinks he's going to be a counterweight. Octavian, again, 18. It's not like he's done much where you can see why else Cicero would want him or want him as a friend. It really does seem like they're like, well, let's cause some problems within the Caesarian faction. All of Caesar's people, let's make them choose between Mark Antony and Octavian. And Octavian's he's just like his dad, his adopted dad. He ignored every norm and actually raised his own troops, which is patently illegal because he has no role in the government at this point. He's just come into Rome because he's now Julius Caesar's heir. He doesn't have a role in the government, but he raises troops, which is a no-no. He says it's only fair to protect himself from Mark Antony. Another quote from the book that kind of sums up this relationship between the Senate and Octavian. The senators, quote, now that they allowed themselves to be represented more and more by Cicero, they had convinced themselves that they required an army to use against Antony. Octavian had an army, but required legal sanction to use it, which only the Senate could give him. What one party lacked, the other could supply. War was now a definite possibility, end quote. You're seeing this relationship with the Senate and Octavian be cultivated. Octavian's acting outside of the law. You'd think that the Senate would not like that, but they're so scared of Mark Antony that they're going to allow it. They're going to allow him to do it.
It seems to me like there just has to be more to the story. There must be records that we've lost that would explain their fear, because, I mean, unless Cicero has the whole Senate under some kind of magic spell.
He does kind of, though, because he's such an amazing orator.
He's a gifted speaker. He must have been just profoundly talented. He must have been incredibly persuasive, because I just don't see anything in Mark Antony's biography at this point to indicate that he's the person that they
should be scared of,
the most frightened of.
That's what I was trying to say before. It just seems so odd at this point that they're so scared of Mark Antony. It feels like they're scared of their own shadow, honestly. I don't know if they're just spooked in the aftermath of Julius Caesar's death. Mark Antony has said that he's trying to get reconciliation, but maybe they just think that he's just biding his time until he kills them all. That's really the only thing I could think of, that jumping at shadows.
I have to tell you, the other thing I find just astonishing is that I do know a little bit about what's going on in one of the corners of the empire, because I do teach comparative religion. And by this point, the Roman footprint extends well into North Africa, Palestine, Judea. I cannot get over the fact that while all of this scheming and all of these energies that are going to coalesce into civil war, Rome's like this cauldron now of instability, and now you have like a private militia being raised. Meanwhile, if you're out there in the provinces as a Roman official, dear God, what are you supposed to do?
You're like,
is anybody going to cut the checks? Are the soldiers going to be paid?
They're like, yeah, Cicero, we get it. You hate Mark Antony, but could you give us some money, please?
Right. Which I guess those are the cracks that a long time down the road, those will be some of the fissures in the empire that lead to it being cut up into various pieces. And then ultimately it will collapse. Spoiler alert, it collapses. But.
Yeah, we do not have a Roman Empire now. Before the real war broke out, there was a war of words. Octavian really spurs Cicero's propaganda campaign against Mark Antony. So this is where the Philippics, this famous series of speeches by Cicero against Mark Antony, were given in the Senate. Kendrick Lamar's feud with Drake, it got nothing on Cicero and Antony's rivalry, because things are about to get real mean. But instead of a song, the Philippics are 14 speeches against Mark Antony. 14.
Wow.
Seems a little excessive.
And these are not short speeches.
Oh, no. I read them all, and I was like, God damn it. It's another one? Jesus, Cicero. I say that I'm not brief, but damn, Cicero. I would say Cicero's a man after my own heart, but not a fan. It seems so excessive. But it's in these speeches that we get a lot of that information about Mark Antony's life up until that point. When we talked about at the first episode, when we were speaking about Mark Antony's upbringing and his more unsavory qualities, a large part of that's coming from Cicero here in the Philippics, who, again, deeply, deeply hostile source. We spoke in the first episode about Catiline and how Cicero had engineered his demise. It's like he's trying to do it all over again, reclaim his old glory, this time with Mark Antony as the villain. It worked the first time for him with Catiline, so why not this time? In fact, Cicero even compares Mark Antony to Catiline in one of these speeches, and even says Antony is worse than Catiline.
Okay. We know that ended with mass executions.
Yeah, the exact quote is, quote, "You whose abominable wickedness is such as to make even Catiline seem tolerable," end quote. Woof. Cicero's just, through the speeches, he's just pouring gasoline all over Rome and lighting the match. Antony had tried so hard to keep this peace after Julius Caesar's death, but Octavian and Cicero, they've had enough of peace. They want Mark Antony. Speech after speech speaks of Antony's corrupt character, the drinking, the womanizing, everything that was the opposite of an upstanding Roman man. To quote Cicero himself again in all his dramatics, quote, "How intolerable is Antony's impudence, his debauchery, and his lust," end quote. Cicero went beyond even just stating Antony's faults. He even accused Antony of being both an enemy of the Republic, but also happy that Caesar was assassinated. So he's saying, you're not only an enemy of the Republic, you hate the Republic, but you are happy that Julius Caesar was assassinated, which we had already talked about, that he said that Antony, used the money to pay off his debts after Caesar's assassination. But here's the quote. "Have you any secret fear that you yourself may appear to have had some connection with that crime?" The crime being the murder of Caesar. I will release you from all apprehension. No one will ever believe it. It's not like you to deserve well of the Republic. The most illustrious men in the Republic are the authors of that exploit. I only say that you are glad it was done. I do not accuse you of having done it. He's exalting the liberators. They're the most illustrious men in the Republic. And he's saying that Antony was not only someone who did not care for the Roman Republic, but that he was glad the murder was done for the reasons that we already talked about, with him benefiting from his friend's death.
Oof.
Yeah, it's some mean stuff. Meanwhile, Mark Antony, he was in the audience of at least the first speech. I could just imagine him turning to everybody and being like, wait, this about me? What?
This seems very specific.
Whatever truth might be to some of the statements in the Philippics, it's character assassination orchestrated and coordinated by Octavian and Cicero together, these newfound BFFs. Antony must have known that Rome's getting a little small. It's not big enough for the two of them, him and Octavian. Once the most powerful man in Rome, Antony's power was waning as Octavian's grew with the support of Cicero and the Senate. So at this time, Antony's consulship, so he's still consul at this time, but it's coming to a close at the end of the year. And we talked about a little bit in the first part that after you're done as consul, it was customary for them to get a lucrative governorship in a province.
Right.
Gives them money, additional prestige, and what do you think the other important thing? You get money, prestige, and something else. Can you guess? It's something Antony probably wants now that maybe war's coming.
Oh, you get access to the military.
Yep, an army. So Antony's increasingly feeling like he needs that. He wanted Gaul, which we had seen that was Caesar's old province. But the problem was that Gaul's already being occupied by Decimus Brutus. So this is not the Brutus of A2 Brutus. I know it's confusing. We have a Brutus and a Decimus Brutus. Didn't I tell you the Romans like to confuse the fuck out of us with the names?
That's normal, though, in study history.
Yeah, Decimus Brutus, he is actually related to the more famous Brutus. Oh, and he's also an assassin of Caesar, so he's a liberator, Decimus Brutus. So both Brutuses have been involved in Caesar's murder. He's already the governor of Gaul, so Antony's going to have a showdown with Decimus Brutus if he wanted Gaul. That's the point. Antony's troubles, though, they were just beginning. His troops, Caesar's old troops, they're not Team Antony all the way. Some, as you can imagine, saw Octavian as Caesar's legal and spiritual heir. It's starting to have that split in the Caesarians from the troops on down. Some people supporting Octavian, some people supporting Mark Antony. That and Octavian had already paid or promised to pay them even more than Mark Antony if they supported him. Octavian is really good at promising a lot. He knows what will get him troops or get them to support him. It's money. Mark Antony actually executed about 300 men of the troops, perhaps even with Fulvia at his side. Women at the side of men in politics and war, big no-no.
So he's flouting convention.
The people are writing this want us to think that Mark Antony, that he can't do anything without his women, whether it's Fulvia and then later Cleopatra. I do side-eye this a little bit, but that is the story. Unfortunately for Antony, so he's thinking about marching closer to Rome to meet the Senate. When he does, 2 of his legions defected to Octavian.
Do we know why?
It's either money, they think that Octavian's Caesar's real heir, or maybe even just the fact that he's with the Senate and they think he's a better bet. Could be all of the above.
So it's not out of some sense of loyalty or anything to it.
No, Octavian's not done anything. He's barely done anything in war. If you're looking at who's the better general, it's Mark Antony. So Mark Antony's, he's making his way towards Rome. But then, whether it's because these legions defected or the idea of starting officially another civil war was just too much to bear, Antony stopped himself from marching any further, so he does not march on Rome. This is where, for all the talk of Antony being impulsive, He rarely does the impulsive thing. He retreats. So this is where, again, if you're thinking about Cicero and the Senate being so scared of him, he never does the thing that I think that they're scared of. In this case, he retreats. He'd only be consul for another month. Instead, he focuses attention on Decimus Brutus in Gaul. And this is where the Senate, they're supporting Decimus Brutus. They're telling him to remain in Gaul while Antony told him to leave. So Decimus Brutus is getting told, stay put by the Senate. And then Antony's saying, I'm coming for you, so you better leave. I'd say poor Decimus Brutus, but he didn't murder Caesar, so I don't know. Meanwhile, in Rome, Octavian was given senatorial status and given a rank for him to lead those troops. This is bypassing not only the lower offices, which he was supposed to go through, and there's those age limits, but he's barely out of his teenage years. He's 19 at this time. This is all Cicero's doing. Quote, Cicero pointed out that that youth was not necessarily a disadvantage in political or military circles. And finally, he vouched for Octavian's good character, end quote. Cicero, he really does love himself some Octavian.
But primarily because he hates Mark Antony.
Yeah, I'm just asking this in a hypothetical, but did Cicero really believe what he was saying? Does he really think that youth is a good thing in politics and in the military, that you just need some fresh new opinions? Does he really believe it? I don't know. Debatable.
This is, again, total conjecture. But, I don't know anything about ancient history, so who cares?
And with ancient history, you never get the psychology of this stuff. So it's all conjecture if you're talking psychology. So conjecture away.
But I could see Cicero as a man who lives all of the adventures of his own life in his head. He's not commanding armies. He's not engaged in conquest. He's not wearing scandalous Eastern tunics while he courts exotic foreign women in the service of an imperial alliance. He's supposed to be the seat of wisdom. He's supposed to be the scholarly presiding officer of Senate tradition. And so for him, I could see, he could tell that the Republic is, he might have aspired for it to be. That's gone. But of these two different flavors of an imperial future, the Mark Antony one is, it's just, he's resentful, he's jealous, so he's going to pick a different horse.
He's jealous because he doesn't look as good in loincloths as Mark Antony. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I mean, what else do we have to latch on to? I mean, you certainly see this in contemporary politics a great deal. I mean, men tend to package up their adolescent insecurities.
Ooh.
And then they take that forward into their political careers, if they end up in a political career or a corporate setting. And then as soon as they have any position of influence or power, they crack open that baggage and to just torture the metaphor, they just trash the hotel room. There's nothing left when it's over. I kind of see that as a organizing metaphor for where the Roman Empire is going to be here. Not that, I mean, again, I don't want to spoil anything, but it's my understanding that once we get into the age of Augustus, there will be a golden era of stability and expansion and economic prosperity.
Yes, Augustus tells us himself that he found a Rome of bricks and left it full of marble. The Augustan propaganda, you saying, yes, he will have a golden age. And again, Augustus is Octavian. Octavian will take the title of Augustus later on. So same person. Cicero is just head scratching at this point. But I do also think that he does think he can manipulate Octavian. I think Octavian's manipulative enough to make Cicero think that I need your help. I need your judgment. You are so wise. He's just using him. And we will see. He is definitely just using him until he can discard him. I think Cicero thinks if there's one person who's going to be able to oust Antony, it's Octavian and he wants Mark Antony gone. Like, it seems like that's almost clouding every other thing, any sort of wisdom. He's so blinded by his hatred of Mark Antony. The Senate sends an army. They sent an army with the new consuls at the head of it, headed for battle with Mark Antony. This is not bluffing. A battle does ensue involving the senatorial army and Mark Antony's army, where one of the consuls is killed. But ultimately, Antony's defeated in battle. Antony loses this battle against the Senate's army. Back in Rome, the Senate and Cicero, they're celebrating what they thought could only be the beginning of the end for Mark Antony. The book describes their joy as, quote, near delirium. I'm just imagining Cicero like blasting some music and dancing in his house at the news that Mark Antony lost.
So is he defeated within Italy, or is he defeated abroad?
It's in northern Italy. So, yeah, this battle is in northern Italy. Cicero, he's so happy. He's like, finally, I've been waiting for this. He's beside himself. It's all going according to plan for Octavian and his allies. Antony, with this defeat, was finally dealt the blow of being named an enemy of the state. So he's an outlaw. He's an enemy of the state now, officially.
I do have to say, though, it's pretty cool that you lose a battle in northern Italy and, we have to retreat to southern France. Gosh, that must really be awful.
It does get kind of bad here. Everyone, perhaps even Antony himself, they all thought this was the end for him. You have to think, even Julius Caesar had been defeated and killed in the end. Not in battle, but by his enemies. Antony's going to have a moment in the wilderness, quite literally, to ponder all this. So him and his remaining troops, they're already lacking supplies. They had to bail really quickly after this battle, so they didn't have time to resupply or anything. And now they're going over the Alps to head to Gaul in the cold of April. Snow's still on the ground. And like I said, the army in defeat had little to no supplies left. They're just lucky to be alive at this point, but they had nothing else but their lives. And they're headed into the Alps. They knew that when they got to the other side of the Alps, if they did, there would be plenty of men who controlled the area, the governors there.
Who would not be thrilled to see him arrive.
Yeah, and they're Caesar's men, but these men hadn't done much in the aftermath to prove their loyalty. So they don't know if they're on the Octavian and the Senate side. So they're heading into the Alps with no supplies, just basically the clothes on their backs. They don't know what's going to happen when they get over there, if they're going to have help or if there's going to be armies there to kill them. Technically, Antony's an enemy of the state. Nobody should be helping him. This is really bad. With a depleted and starving army, if those governors wanted to make war, Antony would be all but done. He'd have no chance. And he's a smart man. He knew it. I don't think he has any idea of grandeur at this point. Antony would also have no guarantee that the men who were following him into the Alps would remain at his side for much longer.
Oh, so he has to worry about betrayal from within.
Yeah, he's a fugitive. He's an enemy of the state, and he doesn't have any legal authority to have this army anymore. If his troops expected riches, land, he doesn't have anything to give them, not at this moment. He's in a bad position, to quote the book, again, because I think this kind of sums up Antony's unfortunate, dwindling situation. And the way in which this time left an indelible change in the man's psyche forever. So, quote, the members of his immediate family were endangered because of their relationship to him. Fortunately, his brothers were loyal. After all Antony had done to keep the state on an even keep, punishing none of the liberators and exercising every restraint to avoid a bloodbath in the city, Rome had rejected him. The man who had marched out of Rome in 44 was still the old Antony, full of daring, light-hearted optimism, and tolerant bonhomie. The man who came back was icily thorough, narrowly focused, and murderous. End quote.
No, is that fair, we think?
I think so. I do think you do see quite a change in him after this. The time in the Alps is giving Oregon Trail. It's giving Donner Party pre-cannibalism. there's not cannibalism that I know of, but they don't have food.
It's bleak. It's very bleak.
Yeah, they don't have any food. They have to drink just random, they call it brackish water. So it's just like water, what's been accumulated with rainfall or melted snow. He's not above it. Antony's not in any better position than his followers. For food, they had to survive on tree bark. I've never had tree bark, but I can't imagine it tastes very good.
Yeah, that actually is one of the things that gets eaten when the Donner Party is stuck.
Oh, so I was really spot on when I called it the Donner Party pre-cannibalism.
Or, it kind of reminds me of Napoleon's army retreating from Russia.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's bleak, man. The one thing you can say, Antony fan or not, he's there through thick and thin with his men. Somehow, until, of course, the very, very, very end, he seemed always able to navigate a crisis. With the help of one of Caesar's other loyal followers, Antony and his men got reinforcements and food. So there's more people to feed, but they at least have food and reinforcements. It's still a dire situation, and he's still on the run. He's still an enemy of the state. But it's buying Antony more time. Eventually, by mid-May, Antony and his troops had made it to Gaul. So they're out of the Alps. They're in Gaul now. He does have that luck. And he'd have even more luck when Antony met up with Lepidus, so one of his old friends and allies. We mentioned after Caesar's assassination, he had been quick to ally himself with Mark Antony. Well, Lepidus is there, and in fact, Mark Antony just strolled into Lepidus' camp one day, just being like, all right, I've got nothing to lose. I'm going to deal with you. See if you're still a friend or if I've lost you to Octavian in the Senate. The Senate and Octavian, they had been buttering Lepidus up in hopes to keep him on their side. So they knew they're trying to manage that situation. What do you think Lepidus does? What do you think he chooses? What would you choose?
Well, the logical choice is not to befriend him. I mean, he's defeated. He's in exile. He's a traitor.
Yeah, you could easily, especially if he just wandered into his camp, you should just kill him, right?
Well, okay, my prediction is that he scorns him. But for this podcast to have a third...
Or another act?
For this particular podcast subject to have a third act, he must befriend him. Do we know if persuasion has to happen there, or is Lepidus just that gracious?
Well, yeah, Lepidus, despite the odds, he does switch sides to Mark Antony's side. He's putting his future on the line, too. In terms of why, Lepidus will tell the Senate, oh, it's the soldiers. The soldiers made him do it. That they threatened him that we join Mark Antony or else, but that seems unlikely. Antony and Lepidus had been in each other's orbit for a while now. I spoke about how they had even betrothed their children together in the days immediately following Caesar's assassination. So whether it was some sort of personal loyalty to Antony, maybe he just really didn't like Octavian and the Senate, it's really hard to tell, but he's Team Antony now. He made a choice, and his choice was Antony. Lepidus was now an enemy of the state, too, operating outside the law. It's actually Lepidus' own brother, ouch, who instigated the proceedings in the Senate to declare him an outlaw. So much for his brother.
Wow. Yeah, he's definitely no longer a part of the fraternity.
But now, between the two men, Antony and Lepidus, they have 10 legions. This is the best news that Mark Antony has had in a long time. Even better for Mark Antony was the fact that Octavian seemed unwilling to throw his lot in or do much of anything to help Decimus Brutus retain Gaul. So remember, Decimus Brutus had helped kill Caesar. He's a liberator. So Octavian, he's supposed to be sending troops and things to help Decimus Brutus, and he's just like, oh, was I supposed to do? Oh, silly me, I haven't done it. He was really biding his time.
It's on my day planner. It's there.
Oh, I didn't see that. I didn't get to that today.
I have to mow the lawn first.
Just blame it on the new calendar. Oh, the new calendar. It's screwing everything up. It seems like he'd rather let Decimus Brutus and Mark Antony fight it out. And whoever won, he'd have one less enemy to fight. So that's Octavian's pragmatism right there. Antony also benefited from a crisis that was brewing in Rome. What Octavian really wanted at this moment was to be consul. Why? The book puts it, quote, he would be able to obtain all he wanted, legalization of his adoption as Caesar's son, condemnation of Caesar's murderers, and sufficient status to face Mark Antony on equal terms. He wants to be consul for all those reasons. In June, Octavian sent some of his men to ask the Senate. They basically come and say, can Octavian be consul, pretty please? That's the first move. What do you think the Senate did, actually? I'll have you guess.
Oh, boy.
I know, I'm putting you on the spot.
I have to think that they're outraged and dispatch an army.
Oh, for Octavian? Because Octavian's asking?
Step me through the options here again.
It's Octavian. He's sending some of his goons, whatever, some of his followers to say, Senate, who they've been playing along with him. Cicero's a big fan of Octavian. So he's asking them, can I be consul? It's either yes, no, or maybe no, but wait till you're older, because technically he's still very young. You'd think, though, that they would say yes, right? Because they've been cozying up to him.
If Cicero has them all in the palm of his hand, I would think, though, that they would be nervous about the fact that we've already had our Rubicon moment, and you've already chased one army out of Italy. So
maybe they're wising up to Octavian, is what you're thinking.
My position would be maybe it's time that we have our own army that we can defend the city with. But I'm not thinking realistically there, and I'm not remembering that the Roman structure doesn't just allow for a senator to freelance their way into a civil war militia kind of thing, right? They have to work with the commanders that are already there.
Yeah, although Octavian already has, remember, he raised his army even before he was legally allowed.
Was allowed to do it.
Yeah, the Senate afterwards gave him permission, but he did it, and then they were like, okay, fine. Well, this time the Senate's not game. So they say no. They say, no, you can't be consul. And with that, Octavian marched on Rome. Now he's bringing his troops in. This is big because we've talked before. It's not good to even have troops in Italy, let alone you're not supposed to bring troops near Rome or in Rome. So there would be no more asking for Octavian. The Senate tried to assemble their own legions from Africa, so they're starting to call in other legions from elsewhere because they know Octavian's marching on them. But in the end, the Senate just gives in. They gave in. They said, okay, our legions aren't going to get here in time. I guess you're consul now. At nearly, he's not even 20 years old. He'll turn 20 soon after. Octavian was now consul. He'd legalize his own adoption, and he'd finally have a trial with none of the defendants attending that found the liberators guilty of Caesar's murder. So he's setting up the showdown with the liberators.
So this is yet another moment where we might say, aha, a milestone in the death of the Republic. Because if there was a chance for any of those old institutions to reassert themselves, the Senate has chosen strongman rule.
So many things that you can point to and say, like, this is the end. Octavian marching on Rome, some people point to that as that's the beginning of the end. The Roman Republic has somehow held itself together despite the civil wars, despite Julius Caesar. But this is the last real test, and the Republic fails. Better news for Mark Antony happened when Decimus Brutus was killed by a Gallic chief. Mark Antony had been in Gaul before with Caesar, so it might have been somebody sympathetic to Mark Antony. We don't know, but perfect. Mark Antony doesn't even have to show down between Decimus Brutus. He has Gaul now.
Nice. He's got France.
He's got friends. And it's now that Octavian reached out to Mark Antony. He's testing the waters for an alliance. The two obviously would not have trusted each other, but I think they must have known that they would be more powerful together than on their own. If Octavian really wanted to get to the liberators, the murderers of Caesar, he really did need Mark Antony, and to a lesser extent, Lepidus. He needed their troops, and he needed Mark Antony's military skill. Because right now, the two biggest liberators, Cassius and Brutus, they've been, since Mark Antony sent them out of Rome, they've had their own territories. They've been governors, and they've been amassing troops and supplies for some time now. They've had plenty of time to build themselves up. So I think that's why Octavian's like, ooh, I don't know if I can do this by myself. Obviously, for Mark Antony, if he wanted to be anything more than an enemy of the state, he needed to be in Octavian's good graces. They both had something to gain in terms of allying themselves together. At an island near modern-day Bologna, Antony, Lepidus, and Octavian struck an agreement. Signed and sealed. So this is the second triumvirate. That's what we call the second triumvirate. This is a pact that gives them extraordinary powers. They're consuls, like dictators, essentially. 3 dictators in all but name. It's a lot of power. The agreement is limited to 5 years, so they give them a 5-year time period. So they're saying, once the crisis is over, once we've killed the liberators, the triumvirate will be dissolved, and I'll go back to normal.
Right. This is ridiculous.
It always works out that way. I mean, Come on. Are you saying that you don't believe that the crisis will be over after they kill the liberators?
I just feel that we're now at a point where these crises, they're inventing them. It's the people scheming for power who create the crisis that spin up some kind of solution to the crisis.
Oh, ye of little faith. You don't trust Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus? Poor Lepidus. I mean,
no,
honestly.
I don't. Although I've read that Augustus, right, Octavian, that he really did identify with Rome as a culture, as some sort of providential footprint in the world that was going to civilize it and harmonize it and bring about a golden era of progress and prosperity. But then again, it's easy to believe that when you come out on top of the blood feud here that's about to happen.
Absolutely. First of all, there's also some more marriage ties. So Lepidus and Antony's kids, they'd stay betrothed. Remember, they had already betrothed them at one point. And then Octavian, he would marry Clodia, who was Antony's stepdaughter. So she's the daughter of Fulvia and her previous husband, Clodius. They're keeping each other in check by marrying into each other's families. Now, remember that first triumvirate of Pompey, Caesar, and Crassus, and how it failed? So I think what you're saying is, which we already talked about, that the second one's going to be doomed for failure in the same way. Octavian was never going to let either man exert any real lasting power. He's just biding his time until he could defeat Mark Antony, because honestly, Lepidus, sorry Lepidus, but you're just there. You're just an extra body. Nobody really cared about Lepidus then or now.
Ouch.
Well, it's true. Before we covered this, if I had said the second triumvirate, would you have said Lepidus? No.
No, I couldn't have predicted the name. That's true.
Mm-hmm. I always think of it as like Arrested Development with Anne. Her?
Okay. Yeah, that's good.
That's my Lepidus thing. We'll see. He gets sidelined pretty quickly afterwards. So don't worry. You don't have to remember Lepidus for much longer. The triumvirate went to work right away. One of their first actions was a proscription or purge of their enemies. To quote the book again, the episode is a stain on all the triumvirs, equaling anything that Sulla or Marius had done in the civil strife of the recent past. End quote. So this is where Antony gets a lot of the blame for this purge. Him and his wife Fulvia. Of course, as I just said, they're not the only ones involved in this purge, but they really become a necessary scapegoat later on. Octavian can clean his own bloody hands. I'm sure you see this in other sort of purges. You talked about like Stalin level purges and other parts of history where conveniently it's very nice to be able to throw somebody under the bus and say they're the reason why we murdered a shit ton of people.
Right. You're just kind of looking at a blueprint for what you'll see in the terror during the French Revolution.
Mm-hmm. It was Robespierre. It was all his fault. We were totally cool until Robespierre wanted to kill everybody. Jeez.
Right. There's always in this whole period of apologetics that follow, right?
Exactly. Octavian's going to win the eventual civil war between him and Mark Antony. So it was very convenient to lay all the bad things that happened under the triumvirate at Antony's feet. Of course, one of the reasons that Mark Antony does get a bulk of the blame is that the most famous of those who died in the proscription, the man who appeared at the very top of the list, was our frenemy, Cicero, Antony's number one hater.
Convenient.
Yes. Sorry, Cicero, I'd say it's been nice knowing you, but I would be lying. Not a huge fan of Cicero, but he's gone now.
So his fall is pretty rapid then.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, does he have any eloquent parting words when he knows that his fate is sealed?
I don't think so. And if he did, I'm not going to say it because I find him really annoying. Bye-bye, Cicero. And the story goes that Cicero's head was brought to Mark Antony's wife, Fulvia, and she poked at his tongue with hairpins.
Why?
Well, Cicero had been the scourge of all three of her husbands.
Oh, I guess that makes sense.
Yeah, if true, I say good for her. It's poking his tongue. He was the orator, so poking the thing that had brought such anger and sorrow to her life. So I say good for her. Go off, queen. I hope that happened. Seriously. But if we want to be honest, you have to say Octavian gets off light here, but he had no real love for Cicero, if we're going to be honest. You know, despite their earlier alliance, he used Cicero at every turn. He milked out as much power as he could get. But in the end, Cicero hated Julius Caesar, and Octavian was never going to forgive him for that. So just as Antony had every reason to want Cicero dead, Octavian also had no further use for him. Way to go, Cicero. You played yourself.
Do we know anything about the consequences for his family?
Cicero's family?
Yeah, I'm just curious.
I do want to cover him at some point as a figure on his own, so we could get into that then. You're going to have to wait for a Cicero-focused episode for that.
We'll put that on the menu for the future.
Mm-hmm. So with blood spilled and a new lease on life for Mark Antony, we're going to leave it there. We're going to leave it there for this week.
Another cliffhanger.
Another cliffhanger.
But Cicero's gone.
He is.
And Caesar's gone. And Pompey's gone.
They're all gone.
So this is quite a body count.
Yeah, next week we're going to get into the Mark Antony and Octavian showdown. We're going to see more of Cleopatra, Octavian being a dick, and a whole lot more death. It's a lot to expect for next time. So, thank you guys. Thank you guys so much for listening. Remember to rate, review, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Overcast. Actually, I don't think Overcast says rating or reviews.
It is the best podcast player, though.
Hey.
I'll put a little plug in for it.
Hey, we don't plug it. We tell them to pay up first. If they want to pay us money, then I'll plug it.
Well, at least they know that we're honest. We're not in the tank for anyone.
All right, Octavian.
Thanks, everybody.
Yes, thank you. Bye, guys.